Picture this. It is 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday.
Oh, boy.
Right. You need to be out the door in exactly 8 minutes, but your kitchen currently looks like the site of a natural disaster.
I feel like I've lived this morning.
We all have, right? One of your kids' shoes has just completely vanished from the face of the earth, and out of nowhere, that mysterious stomachache, the one that magically only seems to strike on school days, has returned with a vengeance.
Of course it has.
And your child, who is perfectly fine laughing, reading a book at bedtime last night, is now having a full-blown, tear-soaked meltdown on the floor right in front of the breakfast cereal.
Yeah, it is the absolute definition of chaos. And it's a specific brand of chaos that plays out in millions of homes every single morning.
It really is the hardest 20 minutes of a family's entire day, usually right before 8 a.m. So whether you're a parent who has lived this specific scenario or, you're just someone who has seen a coworker arrive at the office looking like they've already run an emotional marathon.
Sweating, totally depleted, yeah.
Yeah. Exactly, the stress we are talking about. But today, we're doing a deep dive into some really fascinating source material from a program in Georgia called MentalSpace School.
Right. And the mission here is to look past the surface of that morning chaos.
Because it's not just kids being difficult, is it?
Not at all. We want to understand the actual mechanics of why these meltdowns happen, how the architecture of our school systems is completely misinterpreting them, and how a new immediate clinical model is really changing the trajectory of student mental health.
I think when we actually decode what is happening during those pre-8:00 a.m. meltdowns, we find that the flying backpacks and the crying, it's rarely about defiance.
Right. They're clinical signals. The child's nervous system is broadcasting an SOS, but because we are all in such a rush to beat the morning bell, we almost always misread the transmission.
We tend to read it as a discipline problem, and our sources trace the immediate fallout of this misread signal perfectly.
It's a domino effect.
It really is. The parent finally wrestles the kid into the building, then arrives at work entirely depleted. Meanwhile, the student arrives at their first period class highly dysregulated.
And that state of dysregulation, that is the critical starting point for everything that goes wrong next.
Because they're already on edge.
Exactly. An agitated child walking into a classroom at 8:05 a.m. is just a neurological recipe for conflict. The data actually shows us that this exact window is when a school's first behavior referrals of the day are typically written.
Wow, right out of the gate.
Right out of the gate. The child acts out because their nervous system is overwhelmed. The teacher issues a disciplinary note or a tardy slip, and this really destructive cycle begins.
But the research from MentalSpace School digs into the actual root causes of this morning resistance, and it paints a completely different picture of what's happening under the hood.
Yeah, there are basically 5 root causes we need to talk about.
Let's start with that mysterious stomachache. Parents often assume the kid is just, faking it to get out of a math test.
Right, the classic, I have a tummy ache.
Exactly. But the clinical perspective shows this is rooted in anticipatory anxiety, which triggers a literal physical threat response.
The gastrointestinal distress is very real. The gut and the brain are intimately connected through the enteric nervous system.
So it's not made up.
No,
Yeah.
not at all. When a child experiences anticipatory anxiety, whether it's dread regarding a specific bully on the bus, or maybe a learning disability they're trying to hide in reading class, or just general separation anxiety, their brain perceives a mortal threat.
Like a literal predator is in the room.
Exactly. The amygdala activates the fight or flight response. Blood flow is diverted away from the digestive tract and pushed toward the muscles to prepare for escape.
Wow.
And that physiological shift that causes genuine cramping, nausea, and stomach pain.
So the body is physically preparing to run away from danger, and we are standing there telling them to sit still and eat their cereal.
Right. Eat your Cheerios.
That completely reframes the dynamic. And I think it gets even more volatile when you factor in a child's sleep hygiene, which is the second root cause.
Oh, sleep debt is huge.
A developing brain that hasn't had enough restorative sleep isn't just cranky. The lack of sleep actively dismantles their emotional regulation.
It creates a localized neurological crisis. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for logic, executive function, contextualizing emotions, it requires deep sleep to function properly.
So without sleep, it's just offline.
It essentially stays offline, yeah. Without those neurological breaks, the emotional centers of the brain, the amygdala, just take full control.
So a missing shoe isn't just a minor inconvenience anymore.
No. To a sleep-deprived brain without a functioning prefrontal cortex, A missing shoe feels like an absolute catastrophe.
Which makes the demand of a typical morning routine seem almost impossible. The third cause the sources mention is abrupt transitions.
Yeah, this one is so relatable.
Think about what we are asking a child to do. You are sound asleep, perfectly safe and warm. Suddenly an alarm goes off or someone shakes you awake, and you are immediately thrust into a high-velocity environment.
It's jarring.
It's like being dragged out of bed and shoved directly into the driver's seat of a car going 70 miles per hour on a crowded highway.
I love that analogy. The brain needs a runway to get up to speed.
Exactly.
When a child is abruptly transitioned from the restorative state of sleep into the high-demand, high-sensory environment of a rushed morning, their nervous system simply cannot process the inputs fast enough.
And that leads right into the fourth cause, which is sensory overload. The commands being shouted, get your shoes, brush your teeth, we're going to be late.
The ticking clock.
Right, all of that layers on top of the auditory and tactile inputs. For a sensitive nervous system, it crosses a threshold into pure overwhelm.
And that overwhelm, that is the soil where early school avoidance takes root, which is our fifth point.
School avoidance.
Yeah. This is perhaps the most critical mechanism we need to understand. When a child is standing by the front door, crying, refusing to get in the car, they are experiencing peak anxiety.
And if the parent, who is also probably exhausted and overwhelmed, finally throws their hands up and says, fine, just stay home today, what actually happens in the child's brain in that moment?
The child experiences a massive, immediate wash of neurochemical relief. By avoiding the perceived threat of school, their brain is flooded with dopamine and endorphins.
So it feels good to avoid it.
It is a highly potent reward. And that relief actively rewires the brain. The nervous system learns that the only effective way to survive the anxiety is to avoid the trigger entirely.
Oh, wow. So that is the biological seed of truancy.
Exactly. If we do not interrupt that cycle early, the brain reinforces that avoidance pathway until it becomes a really rigid, ingrained habit.
That makes the typical reaction from families feel incredibly tragic. I mean, when a kid is screaming on the floor, the parent almost always internalizes it. They think, I have lost control of my household. My child is being defiant. I need to enforce stricter discipline. They carry all this guilt, assuming it's a parenting failure.
The guilt is immense, but it's totally misplaced.
Yeah.
This behavior is a vital signal. The child is waving a red flag, communicating that they just do not possess the coping skills or the neurobiological bandwidth to process their environment in that moment.
So if we recognize this as an SOS from the struggling nervous system, we then have to scrutinize how our institutions respond to that SOS.
Right, and it's usually not great.
Because based on the source material, the standard administrative response in most schools is fundamentally mismatched to the problem.
Completely mismatched. Morning resistance is one of the very earliest observable signals a school gets that a child is struggling. Yet the default response is almost always punitive.
Because the school system is largely built on an architecture of compliance,
Right.
right? Not nervous system regulation.
When a child arrives late, dysregulated, refuses to walk into class, the administrative machinery just kicks in.
The outward behavior is tardiness or defiance, so the system issues a tardy slip.
Or a detention, or a parent-teacher conference that's entirely focused on behavioral correction.
I mean, it's like handing out a speeding ticket for a flashing check engine light.
That is exactly what it is.
The school is penalizing the mechanical failure under the hood just because it doesn't fit the speed limit of the morning schedule.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it.
And the timeline the sources lay out regarding this punitive approach is pretty stark. They draw a very sharp contrast between a morning meltdown in August versus that exact same presentation in November.
Yeah, the clinical window for early intervention is remarkably short. In August, at the start of the academic year, that morning resistance is really just a behavioral bud. It's an unformed habit. It's a recent neurological misfiring that can be redirected with relatively light clinical support.
But if the school's only mechanism for 3 months is handing out tardy slips and discipline referrals,
Well, then by November, you're no longer dealing with the behavioral bud. That avoidance pathway we discussed earlier has consolidated into a concrete habit.
right.
And furthermore, the collateral damage has compounded. Because the student's been missing first period every day, they now have significant academic gaps.
So now, on top of their baseline anxiety, they have the added anxiety of being behind in math or reading.
Exactly. And the parents are completely isolated. They have been white-knuckling this chaotic morning routine entirely alone for a full quarter of the year.
Which has to be impacting their own job performance and mental health.
Of course. The situation morphs from an isolated moment of emotional dysregulation into a full-blown systemic crisis. You're looking at truancy courts, academic failure, family trauma.
Which brings us to the alternative proposed in our deep dive today. It's a structural shift. The sources argue for treating a difficult drop-off or repeated morning resistance not as a discipline issue, but as an automatic trigger for a clinical screening pathway.
Yes. Instead of writing a referral to the principal's office, the school writes a referral to a clinical professional.
I mean, moving from a punitive attendance matter to a proactive clinical intervention is arguably the single most impactful step a student support team can take. It reclassifies the entire problem.
It does. But, the theory is brilliant, but let's look at the reality of public education.
Right, because schools are stretched incredibly thin.
Yeah, counselors are managing caseloads of hundreds of students. They're often acting as substitute teachers or test administrators.
You can't just tell a principal to be more clinical and expect it to happen without any infrastructure.
No, which is exactly where the MentalSpace school blueprint comes into play. Recognizing the signal is really only half the battle. Schools require the immediate capacity to process that signal.
So what exactly is MentalSpace doing?
MentalSpace School provides a dedicated K-12 mental health support system tailored specifically for districts in Georgia.
And this goes far beyond a crisis hotline, right?
Oh, way beyond. They are embedding dedicated therapist teams within each individual school's ecosystem.
So what are the core offerings?
They include same-day teletherapy, suicide and violence prevention, family counseling, and crucially, staff wellness.
I'm glad you brought up staff wellness because that component is often overlooked in these discussions.
It really is.
We have discussed the toll on the parent and the student, but we have to consider the teacher standing at the door at 8:05 a.m. They are the ones absorbing that highly dysregulated energy day after day.
And cortisol is contagious.
Totally. If a teacher is constantly receiving students who are in a state of fight or flight, that teacher's nervous system is going to take a huge hit.
Emotional contagion is a very well-documented phenomenon. If the staff's wellness isn't actively supported, they suffer secondary trauma and massive burnout.
And a burnt-out teacher simply doesn't have the emotional bandwidth or the regulatory capacity to recognize the subtle clinical signals of a struggling student.
Right, so by treating the entire ecosystem, MentalSpace ensures the adults actually have the capacity to support the children.
There is also a major administrative driver behind this model. The source material notes that this framework directly supports Georgia districts in hitting their July 2026 deadline for HB 268 compliance.
Right, the legislative mandate.
For those unfamiliar, Georgia's recent HB 268 legislation essentially mandates that school districts establish concrete, actionable mental health protocols. MentalSpace provides a turnkey, structured way to handle an unstructured, messy problem, all while keeping the district legally compliant.
It creates a standardized, predictable pathway for an incredibly unpredictable human element.
I think the feature that stands out the most is the same-day teletherapy. It's really comparable to installing an emergency medical rapid response team directly in the school lobby, but tailored for mental health.
That's a great way to think about it.
A student arrives dysregulated, the check engine light is flashing, and rather than a detention, the rapid response team steps in that very same day to intercept the crisis.
And because the team is dedicated to that specific school, the therapists aren't just anonymous voices.
Oh, they know the school.
Yeah, they become intimately familiar with the school's unique culture, the demographic challenges, the specific student population. That context makes their clinical interventions significantly more effective.
Okay, I hear the logic, but I have to push back here and express some genuine skepticism for a second.
Sure.
Let's look at the reality of that interception moment. You have an exhausted parent and a highly distressed, crying child standing in a busy school office at 8:30 in the morning.
Right.
The solution is same-day teletherapy. My immediate thought is, how on earth does putting a digital screen or a tablet in front of a crying child fix a meltdown?
It sounds counterintuitive.
It feels cold. It feels like we are applying this sterile tech solution to a deeply chaotic, emotional, human moment. Does a video call actually work when emotions are that high?
It is entirely natural to look at a screen and see a barrier to connection. But to understand why this model works, we really have to look at the data and reevaluate what the actual barriers are for these families.
Okay.
The friction in that moment isn't the technology. The friction is the traditional healthcare system.
Walk me through that. What do you mean?
Well, when a family is in crisis on a Tuesday morning, the traditional route requires a logistical mountain.
Oh, finding a therapist is a nightmare.
Exactly. The parent has to find a clinic that's actually accepting new patients, potentially wait 3 months for an intake appointment, take time off work, pull the child out of school again, sit in the waiting room, and then just hope their insurance covers the out-of-network provider.
Right, which it usually doesn't.
Right. That administrative friction prevents families from getting help until the behavioral bud has become that November crisis we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
MentalSpace School uses technology to completely bypass all those physical and administrative barriers.
So they are basically removing the logistics of care.
Yeah.
And the privacy aspect is locked down, right? The sources mention they meet strict HIPAA guidelines for medical privacy, and they're also fully compliant with FERPA standards, meaning the students' educational records and data are legally protected within the school system.
The security is foundational. They have to have that. But the true driver of their success is the human element on the other side of the screen.
The therapists themselves.
Yes. MentalSpace ensures their therapists are licensed, diverse, and culturally competent.
And that cultural competence, I mean, that changes the dynamic entirely.
It changes everything.
If a family is in crisis and the face on the screen fundamentally understands their cultural background, their community context, and perhaps even speaks their primary language, the digital barrier just dissolves.
Yeah, they are no longer talking to a screen. They are talking to a professional who immediately gets it. It creates psychological safety in an incredibly unsafe moment.
It builds instant rapport, and then we have to address the financial barrier, which for many families is just the absolute end of the road.
It's the biggest hurdle.
MentalSpace accepts a vast array of insurance providers. The sources explicitly list Blue Cross Blue Shield, Cigna, Aetna, United Healthcare, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and Amerigroup.
But the detail that really changes the game, and this is huge, is the Medicaid structure.
Yes. For families utilizing Medicaid, the out-of-pocket cost is exactly $0.
$0. No hidden administrative fees, no copays, just zero.
That is highly unusual for mental health services, and it completely alters the landscape for a family living paycheck to paycheck.
It really does.
The secondary trauma of a morning meltdown is often the parent's internal panic of, I know my child needs a therapist, but we simply cannot afford one.
Right. How am I going to pay for this?
Removing that financial terror allows the family to actually focus on healing the child.
When you combine immediate access, cultural competence, and the total elimination of financial barriers, the technology ceases to be a cold screen and becomes a frictionless lifeline. And the hard data from MentalSpace validates this approach.
Let's talk about that data.
They report an 85% family satisfaction rate with the program.
Achieving an 85% satisfaction rate for an intervention delivered during moments of peak family stress is a massive indicator of success.
It's huge. But the student outcomes are even more compelling. The data shows a 92% reduction in anxiety among participants.
92%. Wow.
Yeah. And if we trace that back to our earlier discussion, anticipatory anxiety is the root cause of the physical stomach aches, the sleep disruptions, and the morning resistance.
So by utilizing same-day intervention to treat the root cause, the downstream symptoms just begin to resolve naturally.
Exactly, which perfectly explains their final statistic, an 89% improved attendance rate.
That is incredible. By completely ignoring attendance as a disciplinary issue and instead treating the underlying clinical signal, they actually solve the attendance problem.
It is a brilliant systemic pivot.
Truly, for anyone listening who wants to explore the mechanics of this program or review the data we've discussed, the source notes, their contact info is mentalspaceschool.com, or they can be reached via email at mentalspaceschool@chechetherapy.com.
It represents a fundamental paradigm shift in education. We are finally moving away from punishing the symptoms and moving toward healing the source.
Well, let's recap the ground we've covered today. We started by demystifying the chaos of the pre-8:00 a.m. meltdown. We learned that the vanishing shoes, the abrupt sensory transitions, and the phantom stomach aches are not acts of defiance.
No, they are an SOS from a developing nervous system struggling with sleep debt and anticipatory anxiety.
We examined how the traditional architecture of school discipline often misinterprets these vital signals. By applying punitive measures like tardy slips to a clinical problem, we inadvertently allow a manageable behavioral bud in August to compound into a deeply entrenched, isolating family crisis by November.
And we explored how redesigning that difficult drop-off as a trigger for a clinical screening pathway opens the door for innovative solutions.
Right. By providing immediate, barrier free, culturally competent therapy, especially with those $0 Medicaid models, we can intercept the crisis in real time and completely rewrite the trajectory of a student's academic year.
It really is the difference between building an infrastructure of compliance and building an infrastructure of empathy and actual psychological support.
Absolutely. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to pivot and turn the mirror onto you, the listener.
Oh, this is a good question to ponder.
We have spent this time analyzing the neurological signals of children and how systems ignore them. But consider the architecture of your own life. If we recognize that morning resistance in kids is actually a vital early indicator of burnout, sensory overload, or anxiety that we typically ignore until it becomes a full-blown crisis, what are the subtle morning meltdowns you experience as an adult?
Yeah, what are the signals you're ignoring?
Exactly. What are the daily signals you brush off as just being tired or needing more coffee?
Hitting the snooze button 5
Right.
times.
The physical dread you feel before opening your inbox, snapping at your partner over a misplaced set of keys, or skipping a social event because the thought of the commute just feels insurmountable.
It's all connected.
How much better would your daily life be if you treated your own early avoidance signals as something worthy of immediate care and curiosity, rather than just a lack of self-discipline? Something to think about the next time you find yourself desperately searching for a missing shoe.